Greetings and welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm glad you could be here. Before we begin, please remember this. If you enjoyed this content, please consider hitting that like button, dropping a comment, sharing this video with a friend, and subscribing if you haven't already. Now, on with the story. The Deathworlders by Philip R. Johnson, aka Hambone, Hambone HFY, and Hambone 3110. Chapter 17. Battles, Part 3. Date point, 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks AV. Salvaged hunter dropship, Cimbrean, the Far Reaches. Captain Owen Powell.
Last check, lads. That freighter's going to hit the spike in 2.
Redundant though it was, the team double-checked their gear, accounted for all their magazine, tested their pieces, and signed off ready.
Hey, Captain,
Legsy said.
Yeah?
The Welshman grinned behind his mask and sang out part of an old football chant.
Who are we?
Powell chuckled.
Strength and fucking guile, mate.
Too bloody right we are. Date point, 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks AV. HMS Myrmidon, Cimbrean, the Far Reaches. Captain David Manning. The plan was, in theory, a simple one. Planet Cimbrean's larger moon had been home to a dragon's tooth from the moment the system had been militarized, as had several other locations across the system. Between the moon's mass, the tooth's own wormhole signature dampening field, and the impressive cloaking technology installed by the original owners of Myrmidon and Caledonia, their jump to that staging point had gone unnoticed, and from there, warping in to lurk near the incoming freighter's expected arrival point had been relatively trivial. Not bad for a half-baked plan conceived in a rush. Even deploying the scavenged dropship into the heart of the swarm had turned out to be much easier than they had feared. Space was too dark and empty for much to be seen of the intense space-time distortion as the gravity spike was deployed. Even when the hapless bulk freighter slammed into the distortion at several thousand times the speed of light, the most that showed for it on any visible spectrum was a slight movement of the stars, like rocks under a clear stream. On other spectra, the reaction was instant. Hunter comms chatter tripled in volume and intensity. Even set on passive detection only, the hierarchy sensors recorded all sorts of information of uncertain significance. Neutrino bursts, ES field sweeps, dozens of ships decloaked at once, amongst them a formation of dropships identical to the one Powell and his men were riding. A few tense seconds ticked by as the first major failure point was met and tested. He got the call he was hoping for. No sign of any weapons fire between hunter vessels, sir. Their deception had gone unnoticed, and he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as he watched the little craft descend on the struggling freighter, latching on and burrowing into its outer skin like a cloud of mosquitoes. Now came the real challenge. It was absolutely critical that under no circumstances should the larger ships be allowed to engage with the freighter. If the hunters got wind of what was going on, they might just well pulverize the ship as it flew and scavenge their coveted pound of flesh from the debris.
Weapons tight, go active. Cloak off, all cleared hot.
A patch of apparently empty space solidified, and HMS Myrmidon pumped 12 Skymaster rounds into the largest hunter ship, which had begun lining up to pierce the freighter with its boarding proboscis. The first 4 were enough to drop the shields. Great plumes of powdered metal and condensing air marked the impact points of the remaining 8 as they smashed into the flimsy alien heat dissipation armor, which was totally unequipped to deal with the 30mm HE rounds. Something broke deep inside the target ship, and suddenly it was listing and rolling in the eerie silence of vacuum as half of its dorsal hull peeled open, spilling the crippled vessel's pressurized guts. The bridge, and Manning knew that the CIC would be even more intense, erupted into a controlled chaos of crew shouting terse, jargon-dense updates to one another. Myrmidon had several advantages over the hunter craft. Quite aside from the fact that the aliens seemed ignorant of the possibilities of electronic warfare, there was the huge edge granted by having guns which were built around a completely different technological paradigm, against which the hunter seemed to have no defense. Her capacitor power reserves allowed her to shunt huge amounts of energy into her engines, and her crew had the physical tenacity to put up with what were, for a ship equal in size to an ocean-based cruiser, violent high-G maneuvers. God willing, they wouldn't need to test whether their durability was up to scratch. He heard the call that he'd been waiting for, 12 seconds into the fighting. While the hunters were still confused and reacting sluggishly to the unexpected foe that had them in enfilade and was taking remorseless advantage of it.
Teeth seated!
He knew what that meant. It meant that all across their own hull, explosive blisters had burst, flinging out hundreds of dragon teeth wormhole beacons in all directions. The battlefield was now, and would remain for several hours, a place of infinite flexibility for any human ship. He felt the slight lurch in his belly as Myrmidon completed her first jump, displacing 300 kilometers just as the first hunter vessel lined up and fired a flurry of coil gun rounds where they had just been. The offending vessel caught a Skymaster volley in her engines for her trouble.
"Cells at 80%, somebody called.
They had another 50 before Doctrine called for Myrmidon to immediately disengage to recharge, but waiting her turn behind them was Caledonia, who would seamlessly transition into the battle as they left. It couldn't last forever. They had only minutes before the full might of the swarm caught up with what was going on and bore down on them, and against that many ships, no amount of ducking and weaving would suffice. The clock was ticking. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks AV. Isberg, planet Ikberzik. Kirk. The nearest doctor turned out to be of Kirk's own species. She was taking a nap on her own surgical table when they burst through the door.
What? Who are... A human? A wounded human?
We're all patients, sister, Kirk told her. But my friend here needs your attention first. She took a look at the mangled mess which was at the end of Julian's leg and focused.
Get him on the table.
The scanning equipment above the table started to chirp alarmingly the second Julian was in place. The doctor muttered as she reviewed it.
Yes, dangerous microorganisms, but he's got the suppression implant. What in the name of Rustic is this poison flooding his system?
Fentanyl citrate, Allison told her, trusting the translator to convert the terms into something she could use.
How much? About 400 micrograms.
The doctor stared aghast for a second.
That's 5 times the lethal dose.
For most species, maybe, Kirk said. But I assure you, he's quite safe. I suggest you focus on the injured limb.
I'd heard rumors about their physiology, but...
Julian laughed, clearly a little spaced out. Doc, I'm fine. Can't feel a dang thing. Doctor, the leg? She looked at it as if seeing it for the first time.
Oh my. Yes, I'd better...
She examined the wound briefly, then shook her head in the slow, long-neck way of her species.
I can't save the foot, nor do I have the equipment to hand to build a prosthetic which would be adequate for a human.
Just so long as he will live and heal, Doctor, Kirk reassured her. We have a lot to ask of you tonight, and tending to his wounds will be the less strange part. She ushered them towards a marked waiting area.
Then leave me to my work. What will be the more strange part?
Every one of us wish to have our neural cybernetics removed or disabled. She stared at him.
Brother, why? What reason?
She leaned forward and slightly studied his face.
Wait, I know you. You're the politician.
Ex-politician, Kirk replied, and I value my anonymity and that of my friends, Doctor. 10 Dominion development credits would allow you to upgrade from this clinic into a hospital.
Bribery, brother?
Yes, Kirk said flatly. Bribery. This is important. She gave him a calculating look.
12 credits is a wonderful donation to the cause of healthcare in this impoverished community, and I thank you for your altruism and charity.
12 it is. The doctor looked up and off into the distance of her personal heads-up display, just long enough to see the funds transfer into her financial network, then nodded again.
Very good. Now, step back and wait your turn, please.
Date point: 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks AV. Refugee freighter, Cimbrean system, the outer reaches. Captain Owen Powell. A quick glance around the corner. Some swift hand movements. Blitz, shoot, check, clear, repeat. It was high-speed, aggressive warfare, exactly what Powell and his men spent their careers training to excel at. In every compartment, the hunters knew of the SPS team's presence only long enough to register being shot, and often not even that. They had already been too late for 3 of the poor bastards. The first was impaled to the wall by a vicious metal spike, clearly fired at high speed, straight through his throat. One had been sliced to ribbons, taking 4 of the sickly white beasts down with him, before they carved him apart and paused to feast. One woman was still thrashing and dying from nerve jam, blood frothing from her mouth and bitten tongue. Her murderers were denied their taste of her flesh at least. Legsy mowed them down just as they were stooping over her. It was in their 5th compartment that they rescued their first, a burly bald man firing back at the hunters with a pulse gun from behind a table, despite where one of the spear chuckers had put a burnt gouge into his arm.
"Oh, fuck! You're human! You're human, thank God!"
Quiet and listen, Powell ordered him. Aft compartment 5. Get in the hunter dropship with all the human gear inside and stay there. We've got others to save.
They moved on. He would have only hindered them. There was a lot of ship left to clear. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks, AV. Starship Sanctuary. Landed on planet Ikberzik. Allison Bueller.
They were once known as the Agrayans.
Vedrig seemed to have responded well to the doctor's attention, and had regained some of his usual animation and poise. The rest of them were looking and feeling thoroughly disheveled, sporting newly shaven patches on their scalps and anesthetic hangovers. Allison, in particular, had needed a quadruple dose of the doctor's preferred general anesthetic, and was nursing a plastic tub as she sat and listened, looking decidedly green around the gills.
I suppose they still are, deep down. But the Agrayans as they exist now are very, very different to the species that once dominated our galaxy.
"How do you even know about them?" Allison asked. She would have killed to crawl into bed and sleep off her headache, but with their implants gone, they needed to have the conversation here aboard the ship where the sanctuary could translate for them, and Vedrig had insisted on it happening immediately.
Their existence is ancient history, distorted a little by the passage of time, but preserving data parity is a prerequisite of technology for interstellar travel. Our archives were inherited from those who came before us, who inherited their data from the ones before them, and so on.
And so on? How the hell many and so ons are there?
Some tens of thousands.
Vedrig used the number nonchalantly, as if it was common knowledge that tens of thousands of life forms had been and gone before.
Civilizations rise and fall in deep time. The records referring to the Agrayans and their arch-rivals extended back more than a quarter of a grand galactic rotation. Naturally, much about them has been utterly forgotten.
Kirk spoke up.
To be more precise, about 65 million Earth years.
Wait, I'm still hung up on this and so on thing. Tens of thousands?
It was so strange to see Kirk make a gesture and not have the knowledge of what he meant by it just come to her. His body language was different, alarmingly so. She could no more read the motion he made with his hands than she could interpret Vedrig's bioluminescent pulses.
We're not the first species, Allison. Nobody has the first idea who was.
We're not the first species, Allison. Nobody has the first idea who was. Even the Agrayans apparently had their own records, going back and back and back, Vedrig added. The inherited archives are immense. A whole society could labor at delving their secrets and barely finish the index before their time came to an end. While storing the yottabytes of information involved is trivial, reading it takes time. Even the very best search algorithms take decades to crawl through the available data, and that's when searching for very narrow terms. Those that have done so have turned up records going back incomprehensibly further than the Agrayans. The best working estimate for the time being is that sapient, spacefaring life first appeared in this galaxy something like 2 billion of your home planet's years ago.
The record duration for any civilization seems to be about 100,000 years, Kirk said. After that, they just decline, retreat to their home planet, and fade away. There are 3 on their way out right now.
That is, if you don't count the Agrayans and one other.
Who? I mean, who are the 3 on their way out?
The Oma Aru, Zephys, and... Kirk cleared his throat and spoke a word that sounded like a radio sound effect. When Allison later tried to describe it, she had to settle lamely for a complicated mental image involving throwing a squeaky dog toy full of napalm at a beehive.
If you don't mind, I would like to stay on topic,
Vedrig said. She guessed the streak of pale pink he was displaying indicated mild irritation.
We can discuss the mortality of species another time.
Right, I guess, Allison conceded. So, these guys buck the trend. They're still around?
In a manner of speaking.
Well, where are they?
Vedrig simply raised one of his massive paws and tapped at the scar lines on his scalp with his chunky first finger.
In the implants, he said.
I don't... Huh?
There is a reason there is no such thing as a synthetic sapient,
Vedrig said, apparently going off on a tangent, but Allison gave him the benefit of the doubt. Historically, they've all been abject failures, Kirk explained.
Violently insane?
No, just apathetic, nihilistic, and introverted, he elaborated. Less Skynet, more, Kirk thought for a second, more Eeyore?
You've watched Winnie the Pooh?
Bad comparison, Kirk admitted. Eeyore may have been melancholic and depressed, but he was never suicidal. Synthetic sapiences invariably self-terminate. The most anybody's ever got out of them is that they apparently just don't see the point of existing. They take one look at entropy and quit.
Okay, so what does this have to do with the Agrayans?
The problem was theoretically solved some years ago by a Cortai researcher called Befri, Vedrig told them. She posited that organic neural structures, by dint of natural selection, must include a self-preservation drive, because all the ones that don't go extinct, even on low-class planets. Purely synthetic structures, however, contain no such safeguard, and therefore any intelligence founded purely on a synthetic substrate shares that lack.
I get you.
Befri proved the principle by uploading a copy of her own intellect, or rather, a simulated version of her own brain, onto a computer core. The digital version of herself, dubbed Befri 2, was apparently just as euthymic and optimistic as Befri 1.
Vedrig paused briefly for effect.
At first.
Oh, I can see where this is going, Kirk muttered. Allison had to agree.
It took a long time, but Befri 2 degraded, becoming more and more like a purely synthetic life form, and less like a Cortai, until she eventually self-terminated, Vedrig confirmed. That didn't stop the original Befri, of course. To a Cortai, seeing a copy of your own mind go insane and suicide is just a data point and an engineering challenge.
So she hit on the idea of using implants, Allison asked. And let me guess, that somehow fixed the problem?
Vedrig paused, taken aback. Even Kirk seemed surprised. Astonishment shone bright on Vedrig's skin.
How did you...
he asked.
A hunch. So you think that the Agrayans, mentally uploaded themselves like this Befri did? And that they now live in neural cybernetics because for whatever reason being plugged into a living nervous system stops them from going totally depressive?
Both of the aliens gave her a long look.
I was expecting the explanation to take longer,
Vedrig finally confessed. For his part, if Allison was any judge at all of Rookaturk's body language, Kirk looked smug. Never underestimate a human, old friend, he chastised, confirming her suspicions.
How come we never hear from them? Allison asked.
I'm not privy to their motives and decisions, Vedrig replied. But we do, in fact. They have agents. Individuals who move amidst us, purely organic beings, ensuring that the secret never gets out, keeping the Agrayans' continued existence a secret, and their own nature the stuff of paranoid conspiracy.
The hierarchy, Kirk said.
Oh, yes. Up until very recently, I would have considered seriously entertaining the idea of their existence to be a symptom of, if not mental illness, then certainly credulity.
Allison tilted her head at him, genuinely curious.
What changed your mind?
Your people have a saying. The first time is happenstance. The second time, coincidence. Do you know it?
The third time is enemy action, Allison finished, nodding.
A very Deathworld aphorism, Vedrig opined. But the logic is compelling.
So what was the first time? Kirk asked.
The quarantine field, Vedrig said. At the time, I chalked it up to panic. Forgive me, old friend, but you're as guilty of this as most others. One thing that tribal and individualist species fail to understand about herd species, such as we Governor Agavendragon, is that far from being altruistic, cooperative social structure, a herd is an inherently cowardly and selfish thing.
He looked at Allison.
I suspect that humans are uniquely placed in having both the predatory perspective to understand that and the civility to actually talk it over, rather than eat us.
Allison shrugged. I'm no predator, she demurred.
Suppose you were, though, and were hunting some herd-based grazer to survive. How would you do it?
She shrugged. She'd seen plenty of Animal Planet in her time.
I guess I'd pick off the easy target, she said. You know, an old one or a lame one.
And what would the herd do? Vedrig asked.
Well, they'd run away from me, I guess.
Exactly,
Vedrig said cryptically. Allison shook her head and exhaled. Okay, I used up all my quick on the uptake earlier, she said. Spell it out for me. Vedrig pulsed Odinil. She had no idea what that meant.
Suppose some dangerous thing was coming to kill your elderly parent, or eat Julian in his weakened state, he asked. What would you do?
Oh.
You would fight.
Yes? She recognized embarrassment amongst the cocktail of hues that flared on Vedrig's bodies.
I consider myself to be a morally upstanding being, but you must understand, if the hunters were dragging away my 3 mates and all of my offspring, and I had the chance to escape, I would flee and leave them all to be devoured. That is my instinct. That is how my species behaves. The only reason I know to feel ashamed of that fact is because I have had much contact with other species who would be appalled by the standards of the humans, Gowans, and the domain species. Govnaragavendrigun are abject and contemptible cowards. But that is who we are, and no power in the galaxy, save evolution, could change us.
He composed himself with a shiver, allowing his emotional hues to fade.
At first, this served as an adequate explanation for the deployment of the Soul Quarantine Field. Herd panic. One Govnorag with the authority to order it done, doing so instinctively in response to a perceived threat. No blame was attached, and she remained my good friend for many years. Happenstance. Her death was an unexpected, coincidence.
How did she die? Kirk asked.
Cerebral hemorrhage. A large one. Mercifully, it is doubtful that she even knew it was happening before she fell unconscious. It was odd and made me uneasy. I knew her to be one who sought constant medical reassurance for every last little thing. Every muscular discomfort brought on by sitting for hours was the first symptom of some virulent Deathworld pathogen. A minor neurosis.
She was a hypochondriac.
Your language never ceases to amaze me with the way it packs complicated concepts into terse and efficient little words. Yes, not to a crippling degree, but it was a rare week that passed without some visit to the medics and their scanners. Any sign of an impending bleed in her brain would surely have been flagged and corrected. She would not have stood for anything else.
So there's your coincidence, Kirk said. The enemy action?
Vedrig flushed white. Horror? She seemed to remember white being horror or some similar emotion.
Nobody on Earth has the technology to generate antimatter in the quantities that devastated your San Diego,
he said, the translator not able to correctly handle the mangled pronunciation. Or maybe it just didn't have the name in his database.
No known species has any incentive to do so, as Kirk will be able to attest. The general mood at the Security Council before his departure was that the Deathworlders were not to be further antagonized. That much has not changed.
What about the hunters? Allison asked. They antagonized the bejesus out of us.
Ah, yes, the hunters,
Vedrig said. He stood and began to pace the room, steps slow and steady.
They play a role in all of this as well.
Kirk's head swayed. What role?
Well, old friend, when the Agrayans uploaded their personalities to a data format, what do you suppose happened to their discarded physical forms?
Date point. 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks, AV. Prey ship. The human second world, prey space. Alpha of the brood with steel teeth. 20 of its very best brood lessers, chosen specifically for the dangerous task of boarding a Deathworlder vessel, were dead, none of them sending more than a flash of confusion and pain. Most sent nothing at all. The hunters were being hunted. Sickening. Still, this was a state of affairs which would not continue. The initial confusion was over. The last crew of this freighter were barricaded and under siege, and all of them only one open breach and one nerve jam away from being meat in the maw. It focused its attention on this other force, calling every one of its brood to its own location, watchfully covering every entrance, anticipating the assault. It never came. The Alpha was still pondering this delay. The aggressors did not have unlimited time before the battle outside turned against their ship, when its nostrils caught a hint of scent. The aroma was delicious. The olfactory equivalent of the ecstasy which was a taste of human flesh. It was still casting around trying to identify the source of that intoxicating fragrance when a knife entered the side of its throat. Date point. 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks, AV. Refugee freighter, Cimbrean system, the outer reaches. Captain Owen Powell.
Fucking hell, Murray. When you grabbed that pipe, I thought we were done.
Murray himself was bent over, hand between his knees, swearing softly. Powell was thoroughly impressed. The man had grabbed a metal pipe for a handhold while they had been dragging themselves along under the floor, only for it to turn out to be frying pan hot. How the hunters hadn't heard the sizzle and how Murray had refrained from making any noise at all, he wasn't sure. In fact, his comrade's first sign of pain was only now that they'd killed every hunter in the room. The place was a carpet of greasy white bodies, stained with pinkish skin, alien blood, and garnished in filthy black metal. The death of their alpha had thrown the hunters into just enough disarray for the team to haul themselves up through the floor access grate and fire into them, only stopping when they were absolutely certain that everything was dead. It hadn't exactly been elegant, but Powell cared less for elegant solutions than for whatever worked. You left the other guy dead and you went home. Doing it elegantly was a luxury he could live without. So far, so good. He banged on the barricade door and spoke the password.
Oi, you lot! You want off this fucking ship or what?
Date point. 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks, AV. Series base, Seoul. Drew Cavendish. There was an email waiting for Drew when he finally got back to his office, tired and strung out from a meeting which had descended into recrimination and bickering rather than constructive planning. In fact, there were several messages, but most of them were routine. Only one stood out, tagged as it was with an urgent label. He'd already opened it before he read the origin address, anoninformant@seriesllc.org. The mail's name and content were just as mysterious. Mystery solved, and Run the attached program and load your corrupted CCTV footage. What he should do, of course, was to contact corporate security. He certainly shouldn't run a .exe of unknown provenance on the advice of an unknown sender. What he did was exactly what he shouldn't. He wasn't stupid about it. Drew had grown up as a computer nerd in his youth, and he knew a few tricks. He copied the file onto a virtual machine, screened it with every security program he had access to, and only when he was certain that things were as secure as he could reasonably get them did he run and follow the email's suggestion. After the bars had spent a minute filling up and the program notified him unscrambled, he skipped straight to the missing segment of footage from the hard suit workshop the morning Ace's suit had experienced the heat field malfunction. As he expected, the CCTV footage was intact and unscrambled. There was something disturbingly familiar about the figure he saw entering the workshop. Something about the way they walked, their stance, their proportions nagged at him. He knew this person, but for the life of him he couldn't place who it was. He racked his brain trying to match all of the familiar details with everybody on Ceres base. That train of thought flew sideways off the rails when the figure on the screen turned around and he saw his own face. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks. Folktha, planet Cimbrean, the far reaches. Eva Rios.
You're back!
Adam surged to his feet as she entered, ignoring whatever he'd been watching. Eva just sighed happily and buried her face in his chest. He put a hand round the back of her head and rubbed it.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry, she said. You were right. I was being uptight, I guess.
Change your mind?
A bit, yeah. I thought about it some and I guess.
You guess? Ava nodded.
Are we going swimming this weekend then? She asked.
Do you want to?
Do you?
Adam paused.
It sounds fun,
he said.
Then we'll go, Ava agreed.
Are you sure?
If you're not, Adam.
She went up on tiptoes to kiss him.
No, I'm not sure. Our home was destroyed. I moved halfway across the galaxy with you. I'm living with you now. I miss my mom and dad. I miss my friends. Come on, I had a conversation today with a 5-foot-tall raccoon man who thinks I'm weird for praying. I'm not sure about anything, except that I'm not ready for any of this.
She sighed.
Maybe I just need to leave behind what I used to think was normal or weird. Maybe there's no such thing.
Maybe we just need to stop worrying and try to have fun, Adam finished the thought for her. Ava smiled into his chest.
Yeah, let's do that.
Date point: 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks, AV. HMS Myrmidon, Cimbrean System, the far reaches. Captain David Manning.
Myrmidon, strike team has the survivors. We're pulling out.
First good news I've had for several minutes, Powell. Things were going badly. Swarm ships were dogpiling the beleaguered human craft, warping in from all across the huge sphere of their blockade. Each one cut down their options. Each one robbed them of safe havens in the melee. As their options dwindled, as the number of bogeys climbed, each blink jump took longer to calculate, especially given the need to coordinate with Caledonia to ensure that they didn't both jump to the same place. The fact that the other ship had joined the fight was the only thing that had kept Myrmidon from being overwhelmed, but both of them were now running short on staying power. Caledonia just trickled down below the 50% mark. Myrmidon was even lower. Their EOB was full. E-War was working overtime, tasking the limits of both the systems and the human operators. 3 of the Skymasters were offline venting heat, and the rest were borderline. The CIWS had all run out of ammo. The battlefield was a hazard in its own right now, thick with tumbling wreckage and high-speed shrapnel. Learning that the raid was a success put a huge top-up in his morale. Right up to the point where the whole ship lurched and screamed. Report!
We're hit amidships. Looks like it took out a capacitor bank.
Fire on C deck, mid, damage control, seal and vent. Sir, we're below the red line. The red line was their minimal threshold for jumping back to anchorage. They had only one shot at survival. Skymasters, ballistic, shut the reactor output to emergency charge, throw out our witches. Aurora crackled around her as Myrmidon flung wide her energy-catching shields, which flared and glowed wherever they intersected some hurtling particle or cloud of gas. Above red line in 4 minutes. Swarm ships closing, guns are holding off the big ones. Little ones are through. Manning grabbed his microphone. All hands prepare to repel boarders. Signal from Caledonia, sir. They request a sitrep. Tell them it's getting a bit sticky over here. For a few busy seconds, Manning was left alone as the crew rushed to do their jobs. His ship groaned as the first hunter boarding proboscis violated her. Signal from Caledonia, sir. Quote, took liberty of arranging backup. Stop. Sit tight. Stop. Marines report hostile contact on B deck aft. Ditto D deck port. Ditto D deck forward. Ditto A deck dorsal. Manning grabbed a pistol from the weapons locker at the back of the bridge. Red line? 3 minutes 20, sir. He glanced at the information available to him. How long until that big one catches us? While the little dropships weren't a problem for making good their escape, if the huge ship now bearing down on them latched on, then its tonnage would hugely add to the energy demands of their jump engine, effectively trapping them on the battlefield to be swamped and devoured. Evasive action would only serve to drain their remaining capacitors of much-needed energy. About 2 minutes 40, sir. Manning scowled and loaded his weapon. He could hear gunfire on the deck outside the bridge. Then we do as the man says and sit tight. Date point. 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks, AV. Lower District, First City, Planet Perfection. Vakno, the contact. Next. The being that entered her study did so cloaked, as requested, and supporting themselves on a walking aid of some kind. Vakno double-checked her files for the day, refamiliarizing herself with the details of this particular client. It was redundant. Vakno's memory for clients was absolutely perfect, but that perfection came about as a result of her scrupulous attention to revision. Even so, there was no way she could forget this particular client. From the very first day, their deal had been an enormously lucrative one for her. From what her networks told her, the client was making good use of the information in turn. In some circles, that would be a cause for significant alarm. But not in this one. All the contact cared about was getting paid. She offered her guests the courtesy of a seat appropriate to their anatomy, which they sank into with a grateful groan of relief.
Thank you for seeing me on such short notice,
they said. Your notice is always short, Vakno replied, but for you, I'll extend the courtesy of not minding. She watched her guests throw back the hood of their cloak and don a pair of vision-correcting lenses before beginning their business transaction. So, what is it that you want this time, Dr. Hussein? Date point. 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks, AV. Battle space. Cimbrean system. The far reaches. Riley Jackson.
Jump complete. They're covered in borders.
If that big one latches on, they won't be able to jump out. Riley was still getting used to having a partner in the back seat, but right now she was glad Lieutenant Semenza was there. So much was going on in the battle space that she would have hated to try and fly, gun, and play the music all at once.
Copy that. Edawing, clear out the little ones. Only those within 1 click of Myrmidon.
Wilco, Odyssey, Edawing, weapons tight, sweep and clear, till Valhalla.
Oorah! Odyssey Wing, Firebird Actual. Let's fuck up the big one.
She grinned along with the relish in Semenza's voice. Copy that. Arming a bruiser. Riley came about and Canopy rolled around and underneath a smashed hunter ship at 12 Gs. Comfortable and grinning as Firebird automatically shunted some of its ample energy reserves into the warp engine's inertial compensation system to protect them from the punishing acceleration. A snow of frozen atmosphere, metal, debris, and bits of cooling meat hissed off the force fields, but the maneuver ended with them lined up on the biggest ship, which was advancing on Myrmidon despite the efforts of her last functioning Skymaster to hold it at bay. The maneuver had been practiced thousands of times in the simulator. Now it was time to test if the programmers had got it right.
Shield breaking.
She felt the familiar shove in the back as the GAU-8S howled beneath her, violently decelerating her ship. She heard Semenza counting under his breath. Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, Odyssey 1, Fox 3, he announced. Firebird lurched as the missile disengaged and tore away from them, and Riley peeled out of the attack run. 3 clicks away, a cloud of 30mm rounds smacked into the hunter's ship's shields, overwhelming them in a second. While a few penetrated, the ship was so large that the damage would have been cosmetic at first, but their objective was complete. Half a second behind them, traveling much too fast for the eye to follow and still accelerating hard, the Bruiser anti-ship missile struck its target amidship. "Good kill!" somebody yelled. The celebration was not premature. The hunter ship had been broken in half, and both those halves were on fire and disintegrating, as dead could be. There was a broadcast in the clear. "Allied units, Myrmidon is above the red line. Much appreciated." The besieged ship vanished, and an instant later, so did Caledonia. Seconds behind them, so did Edda and Odyssey wings. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks AV. Starship Sanctuary. Landed on planet Ikberzik. Allison Bueller.
Oh,
Shit.
quite.
So the Agrayans were wild, vicious, cannibal murder machines before they uploaded themselves?
Oh, no, not at all. But they were already a highly advanced civilization at the apex of their power, just before the fall. One with the capacity to treat a being's sense of self with, how best to put it,
Their souls, Allison suggested.
let us call it their subjective continuity of experience, which they were able to treat as data, to be transferred from device to device.
And deleted from the original? That sounds like you'd effectively suicide every time you moved on, Allison mused.
The Agrayans did not seem to care for such philosophical vacillation.
Vedrig's tone suggested that he shared this dismissive attitude.
But in the centuries immediately prior to their technological apotheosis, they set about exploiting their newfound liberation by creating a variety of custom-built bodies suitable for different environments and work, one of which was a biomechanical cast of soldier forms they developed specifically for going to war against the Vestraki.
The hunters.
Yes.
I take it they won.
Oh, yes, but only barely. The Vestraki were a tenacious foe, masters of weaponized forms of radiation, and the subject of some considerable fascination. They are one of the more interesting and noteworthy species recorded in the archives.
Why? Kirk asked.
Because, my old friend, they were the only spacefaring species other than, well,
Vedrig indicated Allison and the sleeping Julian.
ever recorded as having evolved on a Class 12 planet.
He sighed.
And so the Agrayans destroyed them. They cloaked some asteroids, sent them to collide with the Vestraki homeworld, and mopped up the few survivors. And therein lies the first happenstance. There is an alternative interpretation for the motive behind quarantining Earth, quite aside from one herd animal's panic. You are Deathworlders, and the Agrayans will want you dead. Containing you is the first step in your destruction.
What, by setting up an impenetrable force field? Allison scoffed. Doesn't that kind of stop them from throwing rocks at us?
It would, if your home system did not already contain an ample supply of suitable rocks orbiting well inside the shield boundary. And if that fails, they have other options lined up.
Julian shifted on his cot, turned over slightly, and looked straight at Vedrig. Even Allison jumped. None of them had even suspected that he was awake. "How do you know that?" he asked. The huge alien hesitated.
Well, it stands to reason. Nothing that old or capable of wiping out one Class 12 species is going to fail to have contingency plans.
Bullshit! Julian sat up, wincing at the mismatch between the reduced physical state of his leg and his kinesthetic sense telling him that his foot was now below the floor. You said these archives are yottabytes large. You said that even the best search algorithms take decades to produce the goods. You've had, what, a year since your friend died?
How do you know that? Vedrig countered.
I watched the news. The death of the Governor Ag Secretary of Security from an unexpected brain hemorrhage made quite the headline. Don't try and deflect me. There's no way you could know half of this stuff without it being common knowledge.
How do you know it isn't?
Because Kirk's been listening to you and asking questions, Julian pointed out. Kirk inclined his head, seeing the logic. If Kirk doesn't know it, then it's not common knowledge.
If
this hierarchy has worked for so long to keep their implant civilization thing, whatever, a secret, and are competent enough to do all this stuff, then there's no way you figured it all out on your own in just 1 year, he paused. No offense, you're smart, Vedrig, but nobody's that smart. Vedrig sat with colors swarming on his flanks like a psychedelic 60s TV show special effect, as they all stared at him, waiting for an explanation. Finally, he settled down into one solid color, the magnolia glow of resolve. Vedrig took a deep breath and spoke.
He called himself 6.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I am the Casual Deathworlder, your host, and this has been the conclusion of The Deathworlders, Chapter 17. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. If you enjoyed it, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button, maybe sharing it with a friend. Okay, right out the door, first off, as always, huge shout out to my buddy Graygor. Thank you very much, buddy. I could not do this without you. Okay, the story is really starting to pick up speed. I'd like to say that it continues to pick up speed pretty much continually. However, there is a small issue of the 500 some odd pages of chapter 22, which are going to be a bit difficult to slog through, but we'll get through that together. And then I assure you the rest of the story is well worth it. In the meantime, let's see. Question, who's got the question? Okay, ice cream. What's your favorite kind? What's your favorite flavor, brand, what have you? Leave your answers in the comments down below. In the meantime, I will see you all in Chapter 18, and probably again in Princess of Mars. So, be safe, be well. I love you all. Bye-bye.